morning. Thank you all for coming in punctually on the last day of the conference, when people do have a tendency to sleep in a bit late after all that intensive input. We've had many outstanding scholars and practitioners from the United States at EATAW conferences over the years, and Terry Zawacki is no exception. As you can see, she retired last year after many years of service at George Mason University, for which she was given an award for outstanding and long service. She also has an award from her university for distinguished teaching merit. What I believe I couldn't find on her LinkedIn profile, which she should have and I think doesn't have, is an award from the much wider community of academic writing for her services to writing curriculum across the United States and indeed beyond. And we're very lucky to have her with us today. And I'd like you to welcome her. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me? Thank you, John, and thank you, Kurt. I don't see her, but and the EATAW board for inviting me today to give this talk. It's been really wonderful to be at this conference and to learn from so many new colleagues, to meet them and learn from them, and also to reconnect with colleagues I've met in other professional venues. One of the downsides about doing the last plenary of a conference is that there are so many things that I would like to add now to my talk, given the presentations that I've heard. But already I'm going to be quite tight on time, and we have only an hour scheduled for this talk. So you may notice on this introductory slide that I've made a change in the title of my talk. I was definitely overly ambitious when I sent Cart a title and abstract almost 2 months ago saying that I was going to talk about 3 studies, and this morning I'm really only going to talk about 2. The first, quite briefly, being the undergraduate writing research I reported on with my colleague Chris Tice in Engaged Writers and Dynamic Disciplines. And the second, really the heart of my talk today, is the doctoral dissertation writers research that I'm currently engaged in with my colleague Paul Rogers. And I have to say that it's daring for me to talk about this because I've only been writing a little bit on this research so far. So you're sort of hearing some of the first fruits of this research. Given the numbers of conference attendees for whom English is only one language among many, and for so many of you that are working in EAP and ESP contexts, I had hoped to have time to talk a little bit about the International English L2 writing research that I've done, but I'm not going to talk about that today, actually. And if you are interested, I've reported on that research in a chapter in the book WAC and Second Language Writing that's published by Parlor Press and the Clearinghouse, and it was on our Clearinghouse table that Magnus set up. So there's a chapter there, and also more recently in a college composition and communication symposium on internationalization, and I've written a piece on that research with Chuck Bazerman as one of the other authors. So with that, while the undergraduate and the postgraduate research that I'm going to talk about today may seem to have little in common other than a focus on academic writing, given the very different levels of the students and the text that they're producing, what I want to show is that what connects them are the very similar challenges that both groups of students experience when teachers perceive of academic writing as a general skill that one acquires apart from its rhetorical and disciplinary context. This perception along with the general or generic terms that teachers use to describe the features of this academic writing, hides from students the rhetorical situatedness of the text that they are being asked to produce. Before I begin talking about this research, however, I wanted to give you some context. The research, by the way, is US-centric and English medium, from an English medium context. So the participants for both of the research projects that I'll talk about are or were all students and faculty at George Mason University, a large state institution located right outside of Washington, D.C. Mason enrolls over 34,000 students, and as you see on this slide, 10,000 of them approximately are graduate students, and of those reporting ethnicity or speaking another language at the home, approximately 12,000. The university offers 37 doctoral programs, many of which enroll large numbers of international students, for example, biostatistics and conflict analysis and resolution, while others enroll very few, history, for example. And I mention this point because of its relevance to the doctoral dissertation writers' research. Until beginning the dissertation writers' research project, the focus of my research has generally been on undergraduate writing and writers, as I mentioned, most recently second language writers, and always across disciplines, which is what always is framing my research, and genre theory. This is the population that's also been the traditional focus of US WAC programs and writing centers. And so my research has generally been informed my pedagogy and also informed by my pedagogy. But now, with increasing concern about attrition and time to degree in graduate programs, George Mason, like many institutions in the US and transnationally, has begun to seriously consider the writing support needs of this graduate population. In the past, these students were assumed to have developed the academic writing skills needed to succeed in their programs, particularly if they've been schooled in the US. But now, this interest on the part of administrators in graduate level writing support is what led to this, my investigation of dissertation writers, as I'll explain. And finally, I want to, as background, I want to note that some of the terminology I'll use may be different from that used in other higher education contexts. So a point that Castello and Donahue and Russell and Cortez make in their chapters in University Writing Selves and Text in Academic Societies. Academic writing, for example, in some contexts is called university writing to refer to the writing that students do in school, and scientific writing to refer to the writing that scholars do. I'm using it to mean school writing as well. In the US, faculty refers to teachers, not to colleges, while tutor generally refers to students working in a writing center rather than to instructors in a US context. When I talk about courses, I'm referring to units of instruction, and I also use composition to refer to courses focused on general academic writing skills in the US. And I'm using also dissertation rather than doctoral thesis to describe this culminating project. And finally, I want to say that my slides, unlike Jim's beautiful slides yesterday, my slides are quite spare, and I use them mainly to show you the voices of the student and faculty participants in the research that I've done. So with that context, let me turn to the engaged writers research with the aim of showing, as I said, the similar challenges posed for undergraduates and postgraduates by teachers' assumptions about the general academic writing skills they are expected to have learned and carried with them across text and context, across disciplines and fields. On this really crowded slide, you'll note the sources of data for this study, surveys, interviews, and student focus groups and essays for proficiency credit for advanced composition and discipline-based assessment rubrics. When Chris Tyson and I did this research, we did not break out the demographic data by second language writers, unfortunately, in our survey and focus groups. So I'm not able to report on that to you today. For the faculty quoted on this slide, as well as for the majority of the faculty that Tyson and I interviewed, the genres, conventions, and processes of learning to write in their disciplines have become transparent. The unproblematic renderings of the fruits of their research, as David Russell has written. As you see here, the faculty assumed that good academic writing was the very kind of writing they do. Clear, logical, concise, to the point. This was particularly the case for those faculty who saw their main goal in the learner genres that they were assigning to their undergraduate courses as giving students the opportunity to develop good academic college-level writing habits. For the students, however, the genres and conventions they were being asked to practice were not transparent, but rather situated in contexts that were often not made visible to them, requiring them to use various means, as you see on this slide, to figure out what the teacher wants, often with less than successful results. The economics student quoted here, for example, told us that his teacher told him that while the text he used as a model may be appropriate for professionals in the field, it was not what he, the teacher, was looking for because it went beyond the scope of what the class was covering. When the writing they've done or the models they've used are not appropriate to the context, students often attribute their problems to their teacher's individual preferences. For example, as one student said, she had to agree my writing was grammatically correct. She just didn't like my style. They attribute it to teachers' preferences rather than to other contexts from which they may derive. Chris Tyson and I suggest that, based on our research with faculty, that the context from which students are not wrong. Teachers' preferences do come from different contexts, and as do their assignments and evaluation practices. They also come from personal preferences, goals for student writers apart from school writing, or from often unacknowledged systems of activity within larger disciplines, as you see on this slide. The generic or general terms that teachers use to describe their expectations for academic writing also serve to hide contextual differences from students, particularly epistemological and socio-rhetorical differences around, for example, what it means to be original, what constitutes analysis, what voice is appropriate, all significant concerns for the students in the focus groups that we conducted, and also for the international English second language students that I interviewed for my other research. Based on the student data, Tyson and I posited 3 rough stages in the development of an academic writer, with stage 1 writers having a broad and generic sense of consistency in teacher expectations based on rules they've learned and experience writing in very few courses. With more writing experience across many courses, stage 2 writers may sense teacher expectations as being inconsistent and idiosyncratic. As one student said, it's like flipping a coin. I get a different perception from teacher to teacher. And he does get a different perception, but he doesn't know why. Stage 3 writers have developed a nuanced understanding of teacher differences based on the context or communities of practice in which they are writing. But this is not to suggest that all successful student writers have developed that third stage understanding. They may just be very adept at picking up on teacher cues, teacher and textual cues, and applying general writing skills to new contexts. And I also want to emphasize that these stages do not take into account the different developmental stages that for English language learners, about which we in U.S. composition, who typically do not come out of linguistic or TESOL backgrounds, have much to learn from our colleagues in those fields. And as a side note, I'll also say that I wish I had read Michael Carter's 1990 article, The Idea of Expertise, as Tyson and I were working out these stages. His article has since become indispensable to me in thinking about a continuum of development for student writers from novice to expert, and how they assimilate through mostly tacit processes general writing knowledge with local knowledge as they gain situated writing expertise. I like the way Juan, a focus group participant, describes this process that Carter, among others, has theorized when general writing knowledge, as Juan says, fades into the background and becomes the foundation from which you work. How that transfer, transformation, translation process works, as Tian Donahue has argued, is the essential question if we're to understand the development of advanced writing abilities. With this last point, I'll turn to the dissertation writers' research that Paul Rogers and I conducted. As I'll explain, even though the dissertation supervisors interviewed for this study recognized the complex and situated nature of the writing task, many of them also took for granted that students should already know how to write, with the writing itself being largely invisible until disrupted by a student writer's visible struggles to craft knowledge at the expert level expected. They assumed, in other words, that the students could and should, in fact, just go and be with the writing. And yet, even though the doctoral students are no longer novices in their fields, the participants in our study still felt largely unprepared to negotiate the dynamic, complex, and mostly tacit systems of activity comprising dissertation writing in their programs. In focus groups and interviews, they reported many of the same challenges as undergraduates around the process, sorry, I'm reading part of this and losing my place here. They reported many of the same challenges as the undergraduates around teachers' vague and overly general explanations of the genres and authorial identities they were expected to construct. Meanwhile, although the faculty supervisors we interviewed acknowledged the complexity of dissertation writing, they often assumed that the students' difficulties stemmed from the demanding research and analytical thinking processes required at the doctoral level. For the most part, they did not see the writing itself as integral to those processes. Nor did they see their expectations for good academic writing as bound up in the activity systems of their programs and fields. In other words, they took what Joan Turner calls the writtenness of the dissertation for granted, with writing, as she says, erupting as a value system only when what was expected was not there. With this overview, I'm going to step back a minute and talk a little bit about the exigence for the dissertation writers' research project and methods and questions. Paul and I undertook our study at the request of academic administrators at our institution who were deeply concerned about attrition rates and extended time to degree in our doctoral programs. Others attending the meeting to which we were called to discuss these concerns suggested various dissertation-level interventions, including the kinds of workshops parodied on this slide. I don't know if you can read it. Dissertation completion rates are really low. What should we do? Let's offer workshops to help with grammar and formatting. Rather than suggesting interventions, Paul and I left the meeting determined to investigate the writing-related issues from the perspective of both doctoral students and their supervisors so that we could provide data-driven recommendations for interventions and support. And we're also quite interested in articulating a pedagogy of dissertation writing supervision. And I'll confess, we were also intrigued by the idea of replicating the undergraduate engaged writers in dynamic disciplines research at the doctoral level to see how the student and faculty findings might compare across levels and increasingly challenging and complex writing tasks. We also wanted to learn more about the challenges faced by matriculated international L2 dissertation writers, English L2 dissertation writers, which has been a focus in much of my past research, as I said, and who are a growing population for whom no targeted writing support is offered at my institution. Our broad questions, for the study we were guided by these broad questions, and I've highlighted, and I'm going to only read the first two, which comprise the focus of my talk today. The key challenges of dissertation writing from the perspective of students and faculty, the degree to which supervisors can and do make visible the writing and research cultures of their programs and fields. Our hypothesis is based on the paradox that Doreen Stark-Meyering identified in her study of dissertation writers, that for newcomers to a research culture, in this case doctoral students, the discursive knowledge-making processes of that culture constitute new territory, while for long-term members, these processes have become normalized, transparent, invisible, and indeed appear universal, making writing a non-question. And that's paraphrasing Doreen's work. So I want to describe some of our preliminary findings, and I say preliminary because we're still analyzing the data, but also at the end I'll talk about some of the recommendations we have for a pedagogy of dissertation supervision. As you see on this slide, Paul and I collected data from a 10-question online survey of 492 students who'd advanced to candidacy. That's really a phenomenal number of respondents that we got, and we got that because we had the support of doctoral program directors and supervisors across the institution and in the provost office. They come from 32 different doctoral programs. We also collected data from in-person semi-structured interviews with dissertation supervisors from 23 programs and focus groups and phone interviews with 23 dissertation writers. And we still want to deepen that pool of dissertation writers for focus groups and interviews, particularly to try to have more volunteers from English second language writing backgrounds, international students. So this is one of the limitations right now about claims that I might be able to make about these populations. In our analysis of this survey, we wanted to be able to break out the data by individual programs and students' linguistic backgrounds. So we began with demographic questions, and then we asked students to identify what they'd written so far, what was most helpful to them along the way, and what was most challenging to them in terms of the sections and elements of dissertation writing. And I don't have a slide with survey data with graphics or any of that, and I don't have the questions because that kind of information I think would be too hard to see and also not for a plenary talk. But I'm happy to share that with you. We asked students to identify the degree of clarity around the expectations for writing the dissertation and the frequency of their interactions with supervisors and committee members. We concluded the survey with an open-ended question on the kinds of support they most wanted. For the focus groups, student focus groups and interviews, we used the survey questions as a guide and asked some questions from points related to the supervisor interviews. Similarly, our interviews with the supervisors were informed by the student survey data, in particular those related to their understanding of the conventions for dissertation writing in their fields and how students learn these. And we asked a number of questions about working with multilingual writers, including whether they noted particular areas where these students seem to have more difficulty than English L1 writers, what kinds of additional support and advice they gave them, if any, and how much L2 related error might be acceptable in the finished dissertation. Now, I'm not going to talk about those findings today related to the English L2 writers, but I do want to say that all of the supervisors said that for the most part they saw the English L1 and English L2 students experiencing very similar challenges with the structure of a dissertation and the conventions. However, not surprisingly, they also said that the International English L2 students needed more language support and editing work, which many of them were willing to provide, particularly in heavily quantitative fields, whereas one supervisor said this would not be a reason to hold a student back from completing his program. They also said, however, that the final product, whether by an English L1 or L2 student, must be error-free and written in standard edited American English, since that work reflects on them, their programs, and the university. So for these supervisors then, that point was non-negotiable, all of them, even for the second language supervisors. Two of the 10 questions we asked on the survey concerned the most challenging elements of dissertation writing and the most difficult sections to write, which are the points I'm most interested in here, as I said. For these and other questions, Paul and I provided a list of items to be ranked on a 5-point scale of most challenging or most to least challenging or most to least difficult. According to the English L1 survey respondents, the most challenging element of writing the dissertation of the 15 items that we asked them to rank, provided and asked them to rank, was finding time to write. While for the English L2 students, putting ideas into written form was the most challenging. That was the second ranked by the English L1 students. And somewhere third or fourth was finding time to write for the International English L2 students. Also high on the list in the rankings were adapting writing to expectations, choosing the right words, planning and revising, and these were ranked almost equally by all of the respondents. It was interesting, I went to a panel on Monday by Pia Lala, I knew I was going to forget the last part of her name. She's from Aalto University in Finland, and she had to leave early. But she had students in her survey of dissertation writers write in categories of places where they were experiencing challenges, and it was almost identical to what Paul and I had provided, what these students wrote in. For the question on most difficult sections to write, we provided 10 items to rank. Writing the proposal was ranked as by far the most difficult by all of the respondents, followed by the literature review, theories and approaches, and discussion and analysis. While we didn't include an item for posing a research question, viewing this as the main purpose of a proposal, challenges around this point came up repeatedly in the student focus groups and in the supervisor interviews. What the survey results for these questions suggest, and what was borne out in the focus groups, is that the most challenging aspects of dissertation writing are those that require higher levels of sociocognitive and rhetorical writing expertise than students may have developed up to that point. And the students wanted one-on-one support from their supervisors to meet these writing challenges. On the survey and in focus groups and interviews, the students also named regular conversations with their supervisors by a wide margin as the writing support they most needed and wanted. And yet, in troubling contrast, nearly 40% said that they had never or rarely met with their supervisor. A little bit higher for the English L2 writers that saying that they had rarely met, and while for English L1, they said that they were higher for never having met. As I'll show next, what students said that they want from those conversations is explicit, specific how-to advice on writing, related to such items as how to write, how to find a question, how to write a proposal, how to find a question, and make an original contribution. And what I want you to notice is how this language is so similar to what the undergraduates, those terms that they've had difficulty apprehending. What and how many sources to include in the literature review, how to analyze rather than just tell what the data say, a frequent criticism they receive from their supervisors, and how to write in an appropriate voice, another criticism they'd received with only a vague explanation, and which some misread just as undergraduates do as a matter of the teacher not liking their style or the way they wrote. So I'm going to move to the student and supervisor voices now. In describing the challenges they encountered writing the proposal, many of the focus group students indicated that since this was a genre they'd never written before, it was difficult to figure out what was expected, and many looked for models relevant to their fields, which only a few of their programs provided. They also questioned whether the work that they were proposing would make an original contribution since, as one said, it seems like everything has been done before. Many were concerned that their research that their question was not narrow enough or deep enough, as the guides to the general guides for writing dissertations suggested, and as their supervisors had told them. In a moment, I'll show another student's voice talking about the limitations of those general advice guides on writing the dissertation. What was quite noticeable when the students described the challenge of posing a researchable question is that they tended to talk about finding the question, as you see on this slide, as if they expected it to appear. Perhaps because, as many said, no one tells you specifically how you get to a question from a review of the literature, other than you look for the gaps and for something that interests you. As this student says, I've never come across anything substantial to help you understand that. For many of the students writing the literature review and determining what was enough or not enough, what was inside or outside the scope of their topic, was a difficult as well as frustrating experience after they'd spent so much time working with their sources. It's like a lifetime, you know, one student said, only to be told to remove what was deemed to be unimportant or irrelevant, often with little explanation given by their supervisor or committee members, who also often did not agree. The students also found it difficult to interpret advice given in figurative language. As one student explained, she didn't understand what her supervisor meant when he said she needed a thread to go through the review, to hold it together, and a framework to anchor it. She was able to figure it out by going to hear job talks in her department and listening to how candidates described the literature connected to their own projects. While for the students, figuring out the how-to was the most challenging aspect of dissertation writing, for the supervisors, it was the why that they thought presented the most challenge for students. as they said, listen to this language too, the so what, why it matters, seeing the big picture, understanding the spin, to use some of their words. As the supervisor quoted on this slide says, an interest in observing birds is not sufficient for a research project or a dissertation. And yet, as he said, they often have trouble moving from that interest to finding a research and posing a researchable question that matters to them. And this was particularly difficult for students in cross-disciplinary fields. Of the 37 doctoral programs at George Mason, 22 of them are cross-disciplinary or transdisciplinary. For supervisors, conveying why the research matters was sometimes connected to students' difficulties with using an appropriate voice or style, as this slide shows. While this supervisor would likely not be able to explain to the student how critical distance is achieved through stance, form, a relationship to other sources, to his or her own research, and so on, she has a tacit understanding of how the writing is supposed to sound and knows that this student has to get a hold of her emotions. Similarly, the supervisor could see foaming at the mouth on the page, although she may not have been able to point to specific places in the text where that foaming was happening. Which helps to explain then why one of the most frequent student complaints had to do with the vague writing advice their supervisors offered, such as you saw on the earlier Yoda Go and Be With It slide, and as you see on this slide, where you can almost hear the student's frustration about being told to go deeper with her argument. What's also interesting here is her point that in most cases, she has been able to infer what her supervisor expected, so she's moving towards that tacit understanding once it's been pinpointed in her text. But in this case, as she explained, she thought she had already gone deep enough, and she seemed to be genuinely puzzled about where and how to provide more evidence or analysis or whatever it was the supervisor wanted. Go deeper, she said. That's not critique, and it's just not helpful. The clear frustration expressed by students about the generic or vague advice they've been given by their supervisors explains, at least in part, why so many of them looked for other sources to tell them how to write in the ways that were expected, whether these were general advice books for writing the dissertation, websites, and of which there are many, writing center workshops that they found somewhat helpful when they went as support, or dissertations on the library shelves to look at use as models. Even when programs provided model proposals written by students in the program, none of these resources, according to both the survey and focus group results, was as helpful as regular conversations with their supervisors, in spite of the frustrations that vague, non-specific advice might cause. They wanted someone to tell them specifically how that amazing process of making it all come together in the end is supposed to happen. If somebody doesn't tell you how, as this student said, you're not going to find the answers in any of those books, so just stop reading. But for many of the supervisors, the students' writing problems weren't due to a lack of specifics about how to write in the ways expected, but rather stemmed from their difficulties with general academic writing. One of the places this point came up most frequently was in relationship to the literature review, which many supervisors said students approached as, here's everything I've read and everything I know all about on this topic, rather than as a synthesis that frames the question or hypothesis and makes a coherent argument. As many of the supervisors saw it, this was not a thinking problem, but a writing problem. And the Writing Center was the place they could go for writing help, or to an editor, or to peers who knew how to write. The distinction between thinking and writing tended to be made most often by supervisors from programs where the audiences for the research were assumed to be informed general publics with a stake in the research being done, such as, for example, political science, biodefense, public policy, and to some extent, conflict analysis and resolution and environmental science and policy. Yet many of the supervisors, particularly those from cross-disciplinary programs, did acknowledge the complexity of the research and writing challenges presented by their programs. For example, the supervisor from Geoinformation Sciences described her own challenges crossing from an engineering program, which focuses on problems and solutions, in her case in the area of robotics and vision, to her current program, which is housed in the College of Science and requires a hypothesis-driven approach. Such a distinction, a hypothesis-driven dissertation versus an applied solution, holds enormous consequences for dissertation writers, especially for those who are already unclear about expectations for their writing. Perhaps because the Geoinformation Sciences supervisor was also the program director and also a second language writer, she argued vehemently for the need for all faculty supervising dissertations in that program to attend a workshop where they would make their expectations explicit and put these in the list of a detailed criteria to give to students and to use them themselves for critiquing the work. Similarly, some of the students suggested that supervisors and committee members should use templates for giving specific feedback on writing. As the student quoted here says, even describing what the template should include and how it should be organized by categories of feedback: structure, grammar, content, analysis. Look at the vocabulary that she's got, that she has access to. She says there would be room for specific comments explaining what it is they don't like about the structure, the flow, the voice, the grammar. She was particularly adamant about the last point on the slide, that committee members would be required to submit their templates or their feedback to the chair, who would filter it before sending it to the student writer. And I think it's really interesting to think about what these criteria sheets would look like, what these templates would look like when neither the students nor the supervisors have access to that meta language about writing that would help to make expectations clearer. However, many of the supervisors did use other kinds of meta-linguistic explanations, visuals that they used to chart for the students, and drawing how a structure might work. While the supervisor, for the supervisor from the cross-disciplinary cultural studies program, who was trained in early modern literature and is used to looking very closely at text, she was able to provide this kind of explicitness to students and had the language to do that, as she said in her interview, which I'm not showing you here. But she said it is the supervisor's job, if they're to help students, become self-conscious about the analytical moves they are making and to be able to mark them in a certain way rather than proceeding, as we often do, as if the writing itself is for a general audience. And now I'm winding up here. Thank you for being attentive. As I've shown, there were some clear differences, and actually I don't want you to read that slide yet. As I've shown, there were some clear differences in how students and supervisors viewed the role of writing in making knowledge in the dissertation, and also differences around the kinds of writing support that is needed. While the students wanted explicit, specific how-to writing advice, many of the supervisors felt that the students should already have learned how to write well, and that their writing problems around such aspects as focus, synthesis, coherent argument could be addressed by a generalist tutor, an editor, or peers. These differing views may stem, at least in part, from the students' different and supervisors' different perspectives on the dissertation writing process. So by this I mean that both groups are talking about many of the same challenges, but the supervisors have acquired a tacit understanding and the experience of having written a dissertation and the experience of being in the field. So they have a top-down view of the process and the product. But the students, on the other hand, are building that knowledge from the bottom up and trying to understand and gradually learning to craft knowledge in the ways that are appropriate to the communities of practice in which they're working. It's not surprising then that even students at the doctoral level would crave explicit writing advice. For both undergraduates and postgraduates, that need for explicitness suggests that a conscious awareness of the situated rhetorical moves that writers make or can make, and a meta-language for talking about these moves, is a strong factor in the development of writing expertise, as many studies have shown. Also a factor in the development of expertise is having the time and sustained writing experience in a particular community of practice. As the supervisor quoted on this slide suggests, and this is hard to read, so I'm going to read it for you. She understands writing development as a continuum, with each performance leading to more command over the process and more awareness of the moves writers make as they gain expertise. What I came to realize, she observed, is that writing is an analytical process. It's not just a matter of having all the ideas in your head and putting them out there. You work things out through writing, and actually when I was writing the dissertation is probably when I figured that out, because I would sit down to write and I would end up in this entirely different, amazing analytical space. And the second book that I wrote, it's such a better book. So there was something in that process that means that although I had figured out some things in graduate school, I still didn't have a full command until, I'm still developing as a writer. And she shares this insight with her students when she talks with them about dissertation writing, and she said they find that very comforting and reassuring for them as writers. In our research, Paul and I uncovered a number of promising practices towards a pedagogy of dissertation supervision. For example, required colloquia or seminars for supervisors and program directors to articulate expectations and place these in context, meetings between a supervisor and a small group of advisees to surface shared concerns and questions about writing. One of the things I didn't say, by the way, is that the supervisors told us that the English second language students often were quite reluctant to ask questions and ask for help and advice because they feared that the supervisor and their peers would think they did not belong in the program. So for a couple of the supervisors had these small group meetings where students could air those concerns. And also beginning each year with professional development conversations about their career trajectory connected to dissertation writing. As the findings I've reported here suggest, the most promising pedagogical intervention, however, in the dissertation process is regular writing-focused conversations with supervisors. But this conclusion raises more questions, only some of which Paul and I can address with the methods we used and the data that we have, although I did attend several panels where I can see that many of you probably could answer some of these questions based on the data that you're gathering and have gathered. So effective dissertation supervision is a dialogic process. But what are the characteristics of an effective dialogue? What writing content, when, how often, over what period of time, and through what implicit and explicit practices do supervisors transmit expectations, rules, and conventions, and to what effect? Dissertation supervision explicitness is critical in moving students forward. So these are the conclusions that I'm showing you, and then accompanied by the questions. So what role does conscious awareness of the moves writers make in their programs and fields play in developing expertise? What dialogic, metacognitive, metalinguistic practices help make tacit writing knowledge visible, whether general or situated in a program or a field? Dissertation supervision as a pedagogy needs attention at the program and institutional level. What supervisory practices afford students agency and support them as learners and writers? What practices support dissertation supervisors, including, for example, rewarding their time and attention to student writers? And I've purposely ended with this larger institutional question about reward structures to point out the important role that university administrators play in addressing policy levels issues around workload, faculty time, and incentives for effective dissertation supervision, which also now brings me back to undergraduate writing. Whether it's working effectively with dissertation writers or with undergraduate writers in their programs of study, attending to student writing and writers is an activity that is generally unrewarded, unremarked, and especially and undervalued, especially when writing is perceived as a skill separate from text and context, something that students should have learned to do once and for all, and if they haven't, that there are others who are trained in this area, that they can address it. We may be able to change this perception as we learn more about how students, including doctoral students, develop as writers from text to text, context to context, level to level, and share our research and pedagogical practices across fields, scholarly traditions, languages, and national borders, such as the conversation and exchange that's happening here. Thank you for letting me share my research.
Thank you very much indeed, Terry. Personally, I can see a lot of stuff there that's going to be relevant for me, and I hope that you can as well. Because it's a short plenary today, and because we're moving quickly to coffee, we ask your apologies and understanding. We do have about 2 minutes if somebody is dying to ask a question right now. Somebody is, but otherwise the question time will be rather short, and you're invited to carry your questions over either into coffee time or into the panel this afternoon.
Thank you, Terry. I wanted to thank you for talking about first language and second language writers in the same talk, because second language teachers of graduate students feel so isolated from this dialogue that they form their own little group, which consists a lot about complaining about not having anyone pay attention to them. So my question is, how do you feel you can bridge that relation, that they're really doing similar work in second language support for grad students as you're doing in first language?
That's the very reason that I undertook the second language writing research that I started on, because I don't have a TESOL or linguistics or ESP background. But as a writing across the curriculum director and writing center director, I had to know something about that. And so I just really engaged with the literature and have been going on to the symposium on second language writing, reading a lot, talking to colleagues. And this is an argument that I made in the college competent communication piece, is that we have to cross those borders. We have to, because our students are not working in isolation on academic writing skills. You know, they're working in contexts where they need to know something about the moves, as to use Swales' term, that writers make. I think I'll add while we're waiting for her to get the mic is that in composition studies, speaking especially for myself, we have not paid enough attention to language as we need to.
Okay, this is very quick. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Also, I noticed that the words writing center appeared only once in your presentation, and I'm just wondering how I inferred that many of the students you're talking about do not have access to a graduate level writing center or to graduate level ESL support. And I'm just wondering, is that very common in the United States?
I think in many writing centers in the US, yes, that is pretty common. And we do have some targeted writing support for second language writers, but not enough. And that tutor is so busy. For me to reciprocate for what the students gave to me, their time as participants in this study, I offered to tutor them on their dissertations for free. But what I got instead were some email queries that said, I hear you might proofread my dissertation. How much do you charge? And I made it very clear that that's not what I was going to do. Also, and I'll say that I'm working on a proposal for a collection and a special issue of the Writing Lab newsletter that's getting rebranded with a different name on support for graduate writers and writing centers, because I think that that's so important. So if any of you are interested in talking to me about the collection, and we have a number of chapters already in play, and I have to just find time to write the proposal, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Terry.